Welcome, deep divers. Let's kick things off today with a truly jarring thought.
Right.
Imagine October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
a moment so terrifying, President John F. Kennedy himself, he estimated the probability of global nuclear war at between 1 out of 3 and even.
Wow. 1 in 3. That's, yeah.
One wrong move, millions of lives gone in an instant.
Right.
Our escape from that, Kennedy called it awesome. I mean, in the literal sense of inspiring awe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that event perfectly underscores just how profoundly consequential governmental choices can be.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder, truly. The decisions made at the very top, especially during these, acute crises, they ripple through history with unimaginable weight.
For sure.
Understanding how those decisions are made and critically how we interpret them, well, it isn't just academic. It's absolutely essential.
And that's exactly our mission today on the Deep Dive. We've taken a stack of complex, brilliant academic sources research that really digs deep, and we're going to extract the most important insights for you. Our goal is to transform dense research into actionable knowledge, giving you a real shortcut to being incredibly well-informed.
Sort of distilling it down.
Exactly. Today, we're unpacking how we understand critical foreign policy decisions, especially in times of crisis. We'll be looking at the conceptual lenses analysts use and the powerful psychological factors that shape perception.
Okay.
You're going to walk away not just informed, but with a brand new framework for thinking about national security.
So we'll start by exploring 3 fundamental models analysts use to explain government behavior. Seeing nations as everything from, rational chess players
Like a classic view.
to complex, squabbling bureaucracies. Then we'll dive into the fascinating psychology of decision-making, exploring how our brains are hardwired to process and often, let's face it, distort information.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. We'll discover why even seemingly objective facts can be misinterpreted. It's not always straightforward.
No, definitely not.
Next, we'll look at the crucial role domestic politics plays in international crises, focusing on something called audience costs.
Yes. Very important concept.
And why they make some states' threats more credible than others. And finally, well, we have to confront the grim reality of how these misperceptions can directly lead to war.
And what we might be able to do to minimize these dangerous errors.
Exactly. It's going to be a truly illuminating deep dive.
So let's begin with this foundational idea. Understanding foreign affairs isn't just about collecting raw facts.
Right.
It's profoundly shaped by the conceptual lenses we choose, or maybe subconsciously use, to interpret those facts.
Okay.
What an analyst perceives as important, and therefore why they believe an event happened, well, it's deeply intertwined with their underlying assumptions.
It's like a fisherman choosing different nets for different kinds of fish, right? You're not just looking at the water, you're deciding how you're going to look at it and what you expect to find.
Exactly. Graham T. Allison, in his, seminal 1969 work, Conceptual Models in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he really highlighted this.
They're classic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He argued that these implicit frameworks fundamentally shape our explanations and predictions. He proposed 3 distinct models or analytic paradigms to help us understand government behavior, especially during intense crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So think about it this way, listeners. Imagine you're watching a chess game on a screen. You see the pieces move, but you have no idea who or what is actually moving them.
Right.
Your assumptions about the player, is it a single grandmaster, a team following strict protocols, or maybe a group of squabbling advisors that would completely shape your understanding of the game?
That's the power of these conceptual lenses. Your interpretation depends entirely on the lens you're using.
Okay, let's unpack this first model because it's probably the one we all use most naturally, often without even realizing it. It's called the rational policy model, or Model 1.
Right. This model operates on the core assumption that the government acts as a single, unified, rational actor.
A monolith?
Essentially, yes. When we analyze a country's foreign policy through this lens, we see the nation, or the government, as one single entity making calculated decisions.
So if the government is this single rational actor, what does its action look like through this lens?
Its action is seen as a purposive, chosen response to a strategic problem.
Okay.
The logic is that the government considers all available alternatives, weighs their potential consequences, and then deliberately chooses the action that it believes will maximize its value or achieve its strategic objectives most efficiently.
Makes sense.
So when analysts use Model Y, their job is to show what goal the government was pursuing and how the action was a reasonable choice to achieve that goal. You're trying to reconstruct the logic.
So it's all about logical, calculated moves on a global chessboard. That kind of thinking.
That's the essence of it, yeah. Consider the Soviet missile deployment in Cuba. Analysts like Horlick and Rush, looking through a Model I lens, concluded the USSR introduced missiles chiefly by the Soviet leaders' desire to overcome the existing large margin of U.S. strategic superiority.
So they saw it as a rational move to fix a strategic imbalance.
Exactly. A value-maximizing choice to achieve a strategic objective. Or, take deterrence theory. Thomas Schelling's work on nuclear deterrence posits that the stability of the balance of terror reduces war probability if neither side can destroy the other's ability to retaliate first.
Right, mutually assured destruction.
Which inherently assumes rational calculations of costs and benefits on both sides. You have to assume the other side is rational for deterrence to work.
So what does this mean for us? We use Model I almost instinctively, right? It's our gut feeling about why nations act.
It's very intuitive.
But as we'll see, that rational chess player often has a whole, bureaucratic circus going on behind the scenes. It's intuitive, yes, but is it always accurate? Probably not the full picture. Now, let's switch gears to a completely different lens. The organizational process model, or Model 2. This one really changes how you think about government action.
It really does. The core assumption here is that government action is less about deliberate, unified choices from top leaders and more about the outputs of large organizations following established routines.
Okay, so we're looking inside the monolith of Model I now.
Exactly. We're breaking it open. Instead of a grand strategy being consciously chosen, it's more about the gears of the machine turning, the standard procedures kicking in.
So the actor isn't the nation anymore.
No. In Model 2, the actor is actually a constellation of loosely allied organizations. Think military services, intelligence agencies, various government departments.
Okay.
And their actions aren't chosen acts in the rational sense, but rather outputs of these organizational processes. They're enactments of pre-established programs and standard operating procedures, or SOPs.
SOPs, right. The rule book.
The rule book, the playbook. Government leaders can trigger these routines, maybe trim the edges a bit, but Allison argues they often cannot substantially control them. The inertia and the structured nature of these organizations dictate a lot of the actual behavior.
That's a powerful idea. So what are the key concepts that explain how this works?
Well, a key one is factored problems and fractionated power. Problems get divided up among specialized organizations. Each has its own patch, its primary responsibility, and a kind of quasi-independence.
So they all see just their piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that leads to specialized but often quite parochial perceptions. Each organization sees the problem primarily through its own lens, often prioritizing things like, organizational health, protecting its budget, its staff, its mission.
Makes sense. Turf wars and silos.
Pretty much. And then there's action as programmed output. Behavior in any specific case is often just an enactment of these pre-established routines, not some flexible adaptation to the unique situation.
So the playbook is limited.
It's very limited. Programs are rarely tailored perfectly to specific situations and can often seem ill-suited or clumsy in a unique crisis. SOPs are essential for coordinating large numbers of people, but they make behavior seem formalized, sluggish, or even inappropriate in non-standard situations.
And leaders, even someone like the president, they can't just snap their fingers and make these massive bureaucracies change course instantly.
It's notoriously difficult. You mentioned those quotes earlier. Franklin Roosevelt describing efforts to change the Treasury, State Department, and Navy as like punching a featherbed.
Yeah.
And John Kennedy similarly describing the State Department as a bowl full of jelly. These aren't just colorful metaphors. They reflect the deep challenge leaders face trying to exert precise control over vast, routinized bureaucracies.
So how did this Model 2 lens help us understand the Cuban Missile Crisis differently than Model 1?
Okay, take the intelligence failure. Why weren't the missiles discovered earlier than October 14th? From a Model 2 perspective, this wasn't necessarily a failure of the system itself, but rather a predictable consequence of established organizational routines.
How so?
Well, you had information backlogs, refugee reports, CIA agent sightings. This stuff often required weeks for processing due to standard procedures and limited resources.
Right.
And the USIB's September estimate, the one that concluded no offensive missiles were likely in Cuba, Allison argues this was a reasonable and defensible judgment based on the filtered information that actually reached the estimators through the organizational channels. It wasn't a comprehensive view of all raw intelligence floating around.
So it wasn't that the info didn't exist somewhere in the system, but the process of getting it to the right people and interpreting it was constrained by these organizational realities, the standard way of doing things.
Precisely. Or consider the military options. President Kennedy, we know, initially preferred a surgical airstrike to take out the missiles.
Right, a clean, targeted attack.
But the Air Force, when asked, essentially said, no can do. Why? Because they were working from their existing plans, which were for a massive attack against Cuba. They insisted they could only guarantee 90% effectiveness for a broad strike, not a targeted one.
So their pre-existing playbook didn't have a surgical strike option for this specific scenario.
Exactly. Their repertoire of programs simply didn't include it. So the option the political leaders wanted was effectively excluded on the grounds that since the Soviet MRBMs in Cuba were classified mobile in U.S. manuals, extensive bombing was required.
Wow.
And here's the kicker. That fact about the missiles being mobile was later found to be false. They were movable over 6 days, maybe, but not truly mobile in the way the Air Force understood mobility for their existing bombing plans.
So the available organizational programs, the SOPs, literally shaped and limited the options presented to the president. That's incredible.
It really is. And one more quick example. The Navy's implementation of the blockade. They had a detailed plan, an SOP for blockades. When President Kennedy, influenced by the British ambassador, wanted to pull the blockade line closer to Cuba to give Khrushchev more thinking time, the Navy protested.
They didn't like changing the plan.
Not at all. They eventually issued the instructions, but there was this famous confrontation later between Secretary of Defense McNamara and the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Anderson, in the Navy flag plot. McNamara was pushing, asking how they'd handle specific scenarios, like a Soviet ship refusing to answer about its cargo. Anderson reportedly waved the Manual of Navy Regulations and basically shouted, "It's all in there."
Sticking to the book, even under extreme pressure.
It perfectly highlights the rigidity of SOPs and that organizational resistance to deviation, even from the top civilian leadership.
Okay, so Model 2 really helps us understand why governments sometimes seem slow, inflexible, or why outcomes feel unintended, even when leaders have clear goals. It shows the sheer power of the machine, the organization, over the driver, the leader, in certain situations. It's a crucial perspective to add. All right, now let's zoom in even closer. We've gone from the nation as a whole, Model 1, to the organizations within it, Model 2. Now let's look at the third and final lens, the bureaucratic politics model, or Model 3. If Model I sees a unified nation and Model 2 sees organizations, what does Model 3 reveal?
Model 3 takes us down to the level of the individuals within those organizations. Yeah. It assumes that government action is neither a calculated choice by a unified leader nor simply an output of organizational routines, but rather an outcome of various bargaining games among individuals. These are the players holding specific positions within the government structure.
So it's about the people inside the organizations, the personalities, the power struggles, and how they interact.
Precisely. The actor here is no longer a monolith or an organization, but individual players in positions, the president, cabinet secretaries, key advisors, agency heads, and so on.
Okay.
And their actions are the outcomes of various overlapping bargaining games. Think compromises, coalition building, competition for influence, pulling and hauling, and sometimes, as Allison frankly puts it, even foul-ups. Mistakes happen.
That sounds messy.
It is. The underlying logic is that powerful people share power, and they often differ, sometimes profoundly, on what must be done. These differences matter immensely, especially for high-stakes foreign policy issues where the right answer isn't obvious.
So policy gets resolved by politics, essentially, internal politics.
Yes, leading to a resultant, an outcome, that might be distinct from what anyone intended at the start of the process. It's a negotiated reality.
So it's not just about grand strategy, but about who wins the internal debate, who has the influence, who builds the winning coalition, and how that shapes what actually happens.
It's about all of that and more. Players bring their personality, their personal histories, their interests, their commitments, their ambitions to their formal position. A Secretary of State, for example, isn't just executing policy. They're juggling multiple roles. Presidential advisor, colleague to other secretaries, chief diplomat, head of a huge department, a voice to Congress, maybe even a future political candidate.
Wow, yeah, lots of hats.
And performance, in one role, affects their power and influence in the others. Their view of any given issue is inevitably colored by their position. reflecting not just organizational perspectives, but also their personal baggage sensitivities, past commitments, reputation, relationships.
Everyone comes to the table with their own angle.
Absolutely. Players fight for outcomes that advance their conception of the national interest, sure, but also outcomes that favor their agency, their specific programs, their allies' welfare, and yes, sometimes their personal interests and standing. Power in this game is an elusive blend of formal authority, expertise, control over information, institutional backing, combined with personal skill, will, and how others perceive them.
This is a much, much messier picture than Model I's rational actor. How did this lens change our understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Dramatically. Let's look first at the politics of discovery. Why did it take so long to confirm the missiles were there? Well, remember, Cuba was the Kennedy administration's political Achilles heel, especially right before the 1962 congressional elections.
Right. There was huge domestic pressure.
Immense pressure.
Yeah.
Republican senators like Keating were hammering the administration, attacking the perceived do-nothing policy towards Cuba. So there was a real political sensitivity. Now, John McConey, the CIA director, he suspected offensive missiles were going in much earlier, but he was initially met with a cold reception. His cables raising concerns weren't widely distributed outside the CIA, partly, it seems, because the president had taken a strong public stance against provocative Soviet actions in Cuba, and confirming missiles would contradict that.
So admitting McConey might be right had political downsides.
Potentially, yes. And then there was the decision by COMOR, the Committee on Overhead Reconnaissance, on September 10th, to avoid flying U-2s over western Cuba, where Soviet SAM sites were becoming operational.
Why?
The rationale partly was to reduce the probability of losing a U-2, which would inevitably become public and risk chopping off the limb on which the president was sitting politically. It was a decision with clear political implications, not just technical intelligence ones.
So even the act of gathering intelligence, the when and where of the U-2 flights, was affected by internal political calculations and sensitivities.
Absolutely. McConey eventually had to really push. His victory in getting the October 4th COMOR decision to finally authorize flights over western Cuba, the flight that found the missiles, was a result of his persistent lobbying, bringing evidence from DIA and CIA analysts to bear, effectively overturning the earlier intelligence estimate without formally reopening it. This required active political maneuvering within the bureaucracy.
Fascinating. And what about the politics of choice? How the blockade was chosen over the airstrike? Model 3 must have a lot to say there.
Oh, absolutely. Here you see a vivid illustration of diverse views clashing. President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy felt a deep poignancy of betrayal by Khrushchev. It was personal.
Yeah.
Secretary McNamara, however, coming from a more analytical systems perspective, framed it coolly as an inevitable occurrence, just a predictable narrowing of the missile gap, with ultimately small strategic implications. His famous line was basically, a missile is a missile, whether it's launched from the USSR or Cuba.
A very different emotional temperature.
Completely. McConey, the CIA director, the Cassandra who'd warned about the missiles, argued forcefully for an immediate airstrike. He saw it as a necessary response, a daring political probe. Ted Sorensen, the president's speechwriter and close advisor, also felt that sense of betrayal. Each key player's position, background, and personal feelings were shaping their recommendation.
So how did they land on the blockade? Kennedy initially favored the airstrike, right?
He did, as did most of his advisors initially. But a powerful coalition emerged against the airstrike and for the blockade. This coalition included key figures like McNamara, Robert Kennedy, who became a strong dove on this, and Sorensen. They successfully resisted the pressure for an immediate military attack.
What helped them win that argument?
Several things. The moral argument against a surprise attack, reminiscent of Pearl Harbor, weighed heavily, especially on Robert Kennedy. There were practical concerns about hitting all the missiles and potential Soviet retaliation in Berlin. And crucially, remember that piece of information from the Air Force we discussed under Model 2.
That they couldn't guarantee a surgical strike.
Exactly. That inaccurate piece of information, as Allison calls it, significantly weakened the case for the airstrike and strengthened the hand of the blockade proponents. It provided a rationale for caution.
So the president's initial preference for action, combined with the strong resistance from a key coalition, the moral arguments, the fear of escalation, and even that possibly flawed piece of organizational output from the Air Force, all led to the blockade. It really was a collage of factors, not a single rational calculation.
That's the essence of Model 3. It wasn't a clean decision. It was a complex interplay of personalities, institutional positions, domestic political pressures, personal relationships, arguments, bargaining, and even chance information, with an outcome, the blockade, that was a resultant distinct from what anyone intended at the very outset of those intense 13 days.
Wow. What this means for us, then, is that even in moments of grave national crisis, policy isn't always a grand, unified strategy. It's often a dynamic, messy interplay of individuals and their agendas, their perceptions, their power struggles, leading to consequences that are sometimes unexpected or unintended. Model 3 really adds that human political layer. Okay, so we've gone through these three really fascinating lenses. Model 1, seeing a rational nation. Model 2, seeing outputs of big organizations. And Model 3, seeing the messy politics of individual players. Why do they all matter, and how do they fit together? It feels like they could contradict each other sometimes.
They certainly offer different explanations, and that's the point. Each model provides a distinct, yet potentially valid, way of understanding the same event, like the U.S. blockade of Cuba.
Right.
Model I sees it as a rational choice to counter a strategic threat from the Soviet Union. Model 2 views it, in part, as an output shaped by the intelligence community's routines and the military's pre-existing operational plans. And Model 3 interprets it as the specific political outcome of intense internal bargaining among Kennedy and his key advisors in the XCOM.
So it's not really about choosing one correct model, is it? It's more about using them all to get a more complete, maybe three-dimensional picture.
Precisely. While Model 1 is often the default, the standard way we tend to think, Models 2 and 3 are absolutely crucial for a fuller, richer understanding. Allison argues that important events aren't just the consequences of single important decisions by monolithic entities. Rather, they're often the consequences of innumerable and often conflicting smaller actions by individuals at various levels of the government.
That makes a lot of sense.
By consciously dissecting an event through these different perspectives, we uncover layers of complexity, the organizational constraints, the political infighting that a simple Model I analysis just can't capture.
And this isn't just about looking back and explaining history, is it? Can these models actually help us think about the future, maybe even predict events?
Allison suggests they can. They offer different sets of questions to ask and different factors to look for. For instance, applying Model 2 to analyze Soviet force posture back then helped analysts understand things like why there wasn't a bomber gap feared in the 50s, perhaps because the Soviet Air Force was organizationally weak relative to ground forces.
Okay.
Or why the Soviet ICBM buildup was initially slower than some expected, perhaps, because the ground forces, not a separate strategic rocket force initially, controlled the missiles and had other priorities. Model 2 points you towards organizational missions and capabilities.
And Model 3.
Using Model 3, we might predict, for example, that strategic arms control agreements that significantly threaten the power bases or core missions of important players within either government, like specific military services or design bureaus, will be much harder to negotiate and even harder to sustain over time. You have to analyze the internal political game.
That's a powerful implication. It moves us beyond just looking at stated national interests to the internal dynamics of how decisions are actually made and implemented and what might derail them.
And this leads Allison to call for synthesis. The models aren't mutually exclusive. They often operate simultaneously. An adequate synthesis would require understanding which types of decisions or which phases of a decision process are more amenable to explanation by one model over another. And importantly, how external market factors, like the strategic environment in Model 1, interact with the internal mechanisms of organizations and politics, Models 2 and 3.
Okay, so by consciously using these three lenses, you, the listener, gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of international events. You can move beyond simple headlines and appreciate the complex forces really at play. It's a way to think more critically about global affairs. We've explored the organizational structures and the political games inside government. But at the heart of all this, pulling the levers, making the arguments, are individual human beings with all their quirks, beliefs, emotions, and, well, biases.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into next. The psychology of decision-making in international security.
Okay.
Authors like James Goldgeier and Robert Jervis argue very persuasively that understanding international security fundamentally requires delving into the human mind. It's not just about objective, rational calculations, assuming leaders are like computers processing information perfectly.
Right.
Systematic biases and deep-seated psychological needs are always at play, profoundly shaping how leaders perceive information and respond to the world around them.
So it's not just about occasional miscalculation, then. It's something more fundamental.
Yes, it's far more pervasive. Psychology is useful not just for understanding those moments of obvious miscalculation, but because, as Goldgeier puts it, systematic biases are always present in individual decision-making.
Always.
That's the argument. And decision-makers, like all humans, aren't always perfect optimizers seeking the absolute best outcome. Often they satisfice.
Satisfice, meaning?
It's a term coined by Herbert Simon. It means seeking solutions that are good enough, that meet basic goals and minimize immediate costs or risks, rather than going through an exhaustive search for the absolute optimal policy, which might be impossible anyway given time and information constraints.
That makes sense. We do that in our own lives, right? We look for good enough solutions most of the time.
Indeed. And a major factor influencing how we process information is our need for cognitive consistency and the power of prior expectations.
Okay, break that down.
Basically, we don't just absorb facts neutrally. We interpret and sometimes even identify what counts as a fact only with the aid of our existing hypotheses, theories, and beliefs about the world. As Jervis puts it quite starkly, pure empiricism is impossible. Our pre-existing beliefs act as a lens, filtering everything.
And this leads directly to what we often call confirmation bias.
Yes, exactly. We have a strong tendency to notice, interpret, and recall information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. We tend to adjust incoming information to fit what we already think is true. Jervis cites studies where, once a partial confirmation occurs, it seemed that nothing could change the subject's report.
We get locked in.
We can. Now, this isn't always irrational in a strict sense. If you constantly discarded your theories every time a piece of disconfirming evidence came along, you'd never be able to build any coherent understanding of the world. Some resistance to change is necessary.
True.
But too much rigidity, a failure to update beliefs, even in the face of compelling new data, well, that can be incredibly dangerous in foreign policy.
Can you give us a historical example of this kind of confirmation bias in action?
A fascinating non-political one Jervis mentions is the astronomer Lalande. He actually observed Neptune back in 1795, but failed to recognize it as a new planet. Why? Because his observations contradicted the prevailing hypotheses about planetary orbits at the time. He saw data that didn't fit his theory, assumed his observation was an error, and effectively ignored it.
Wow. He missed discovering a planet because of his pre-existing beliefs.
Exactly. Now shift to the political realm. Think about Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain before World War II. They had vastly differing views on Hitler's intentions.
The polar opposites.
Right. Yet, Jervis argues, they both interpreted ambiguous information coming out of Germany, and there was plenty of ambiguity in ways that fitted their existing hypotheses. Churchill saw every aggressive move or statement as confirming Hitler's fundamentally expansionist nature. Chamberlain tended to seize on any conciliatory gesture or ambiguous statement as evidence that Hitler could be appeased and was ultimately reasonable.
So the same facts led to opposite conclusions because their starting points were so different.
Precisely. Their prior beliefs determined their interpretation of the very same events.
So what does this all mean for us? It really hits home, doesn't it? Ever had your mind made up about something, maybe a political issue or even a person, and then found it incredibly hard to really see or accept evidence that contradicted that view?
We all do it.
That's exactly what we're talking about, cognitive consistency, confirmation bias. But imagine that operating on a global scale, influencing decisions about war and peace with millions of lives potentially hanging in the balance. It's quite sobering.
Building directly on that, decision makers don't just have general beliefs, they rely heavily on prior expectations in cognitive maps or schemas, which are often profoundly shaped by particularly vivid, formative experiences and historical analogies.
Ah, the famous analogies, like always fighting the last war. You mentioned Munich, Pearl Harbor, Vietnam earlier.
Exactly those. These powerful historical events become mental shortcuts, templates for understanding current situations, sometimes appropriately, sometimes not. Truman's immediate reaction to the North Korean invasion across the 38th parallel in 1950, for example, was reportedly to think of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the 1930s, and appeasement. That analogy framed his response.
So these past events act as powerful filters for new information, coloring how leaders see the present.
They do. And it's not just major historical events. Personal background plays a significant role, too. Jervis points out how Joseph Kennedy's background as a businessman shaped his view of German aggression in the late 1930s. He tended to see it primarily in economic terms rather than as a revolutionary ideological threat.
Interesting.
Similarly, some have argued that Chamberlain's own business background might have made him more inclined to believe Hitler was ultimately pragmatic, someone he could strike a deal with, not fundamentally different from himself.
So their personal lens, shaped by their career even before they become leaders, can influence how they perceive international threats. It's not just abstract ideology.
And professional training matters too. Jervis suggests that diplomats, whose job often involves the early detection of potential threats, might, through their training and experience, become more sensitive to the chance that others were aggressive. Their professional context can, in a sense, hardwire them to look for certain patterns, perhaps even overinterpreting ambiguous signals as hostile.
That brings us to another really important point you touched on. How much resistance there is to changing these deeply held expectations once they're formed.
It's significant. Jervis argues it often takes overwhelming, disconfirming evidence to override prior expectations. People are generally reluctant to change their core beliefs about how the world works or how a particular adversary behaves.
And sometimes success can be the enemy.
That's a key insight. Nothing fails like success. If a past strategy worked or seemed to work, it becomes incredibly hard to persuade leaders to change it, even if the underlying conditions have changed dramatically. The old playbook feels safe and proven.
Can you give examples of where this resistance led to major failures, like deterrence failing?
Jervis provides several striking examples. Stalin, despite receiving mounds of evidence from various sources about Hitler's impending invasion in 1941, refused to believe it. Why? Partly because his prior expectation, based perhaps on past dealings or Marxist theory, was that Hitler would issue an ultimatum first, not launch a surprise attack. His expectation blinded him to the data.
Wow.
Or consider 1973. Both U.S. and Israeli leaders largely ignored numerous warning signs of the impending coordinated Arab attack. Their prior expectations were overwhelmingly shaped on Israel's swift and decisive victory in the 1967 Six-Day War. They simply couldn't believe the Arab states would dare or be capable of launching such an offensive. Past success bred complacency.
In Korea 1950.
It's a similar dynamic. General MacArthur and President Truman largely failed to take Chinese warnings seriously when UN forces approached the Yalu River. Their expectation was that China wouldn't intervene, or couldn't intervene effectively. They misread the signals because they didn't fit their pre-existing picture.
It really makes you consider how our own personal histories and successes profoundly shape how we see the world, doesn't it? We build these mental models based on what worked before.
We absolutely do.
And then to imagine that same dynamic playing out on a global scale, impacting the decisions of nations, potentially leading them to ignore clear warnings because they don't fit the established narrative, it's a powerful psychological force. Now, let's dig into some really tricky psychological biases that seem almost built into the structure of international relations. We're talking about how we interpret our own actions versus the actions of others, especially adversaries.
Yes, this is crucial territory. One of the most important concepts here is the fundamental attribution error, a term from social psychology that Jervis applies brilliantly to international politics.
Okay, what is it?
The core hypothesis is that actors tend to attribute others' hostile behavior to their dispositional intentions, not necessity. But they attribute their own hostile behavior to necessity, not their dispositional intentions.
Okay, translate that. So when they do something bad, it's because they're inherently bad, aggressive people.
Right. It reflects their fundamental character, their hostile intentions.
But when we do something bad or something that looks aggressive...
Well, that's different. Our actions are forced upon us by the situation, by necessity. We had no choice. It doesn't reflect our true, fundamentally peaceful or defensive nature.
So their aggression shows who they are. Our aggression shows the tough situation we're in.
Exactly. You can see how this bias makes conflict spiral so much worse. It makes it incredibly difficult for adversaries to ever gain reputations for lacking resolve or being genuinely peaceful, because any accommodation they make, any conciliatory move, is likely to be discounted by us as merely situational. Oh, they backed down because they were weak in that instance. Not, maybe they aren't inherently aggressive after all.
Yeah.
But any hostile behavior they exhibit immediately confirms our negative predispositions about their character. Meanwhile, we expect them to understand that our hostile actions are purely defensive responses to their aggression.
Jervis quotes Herbert Butterfield on this, doesn't he? Something about fear.
Yes, it's a brilliant quote. We vividly feel the terrible fear that you have of the other party, but you cannot enter into the other man's counter-fear. Because, from your perspective, you know your own good intentions. You know you're not trying to be aggressive, so you simply can't fathom why the other side would be genuinely afraid of you.
That's a profound disconnect, a fundamental lack of empathy, almost structurally induced. What about this centralization bias?
This is another key hypothesis from Jervis. It states that actors tend to see the behavior of others as more centralized, disciplined, and coordinated than it is.
We assume they have their act together more than they actually do.
Pretty much. We systematically underestimate the degree of internal bargaining, the misunderstandings, the bureaucratic snafus, the instances of subordinates not following instructions or pursuing their own agendas that occur within other states. We project a level of coherence onto them that may not exist.
Why do we do that? It seems counterintuitive if we know our own government is often messy.
Well, partly because we typically see only the finished product of another state's policy, the official statement, the final action. We don't see the messy process behind it, and Jervis argues it's cognitively simpler to try to construct a rational explanation for their behavior, to assume it was all planned and intended, even though we know perfectly well that our own policies aren't always so rational or perfectly coordinated.
We just don't have insight into their internal workings.
Exactly. We're unfamiliar with their internal processes, their bureaucratic politics. Back to Model 3. This bias can also extend to assuming that what the foreign ministry says reflects the entire government's unified position, even if the government is actually deeply divided on the issue. Jervis gives an example from World War I, where Allied governments misperceived Japanese intentions, partly because they were talking mostly to Foreign Minister Motono, whose views represented only a minority faction within the Japanese government at the time.
So you can get a completely skewed picture by talking to the wrong person, or assuming unity where there's division. And all of this is compounded by general communication problems, I imagine. Sending signals across cultures and political systems must be fraught with difficulty.
Absolutely. Jervis highlights that misunderstanding is highly likely when messages are sent from a different background of concerns and information than is possessed by the receiver. Both sides tend to assume, often wrongly, that the other shares the same background knowledge, context, and interpretation framework.
So what seems obvious to the sender might be totally opaque or misinterpreted by the receiver.
Precisely. And there's the related issue of the sender's presumption of clarity. When people, especially governments, spend a great deal of time crafting a plan or a message, they tend to think the message they wish to convey will be crystal clear to the receiver. They overlook how obvious the message seems to them, primarily because they know the context, the intent, what signals to look for. The receiver lacks that internal knowledge.
It's like an inside joke that the other person isn't in on.
A potentially very dangerous inside joke, yes. And sometimes actions intended to send a signal just go awry due to unforeseen events or poor implementation, conveying an entirely unintended message.
Okay, so pulling this section together. This is why it's so easy to demonize an opponent, isn't it? We instinctively interpret their actions in the worst possible light, attribution error, while assuming they're acting with perfect coordination, centralization bias, and we struggle to get our own message across clearly. It's a recipe for misunderstanding and escalating conflict. Communicating clearly across national lines is incredibly difficult.
Okay, this is all quite concerning. We've got these conceptual lenses that might filter reality, and then these deep-seated psychological tendencies and biases that distort perception. Is there anything leaders or even organizations can actually do to guard against making these potentially catastrophic errors in judgment?
Yes, fortunately there are potential safeguards, though Jervis and others acknowledge they're not always easy to implement and have their own cost. The first, and perhaps most crucial step, is simply cultivating an awareness of bias.
Just knowing these traps exist. Knowing they exist and actively reminding yourself that your own interpretations are not unbiased, objective truth. Decision makers need to be keenly aware that their views are inevitably heavily influenced by the theories they expect to be verified. What seems self-evident, or the only logical explanation to one person, may in fact support an entirely different explanation to someone with different starting assumptions or biases.
So step one is humility. Recognizing that your own perception is not absolute truth.
Exactly. And since truly unbiased information processing is probably impossible for humans, the next step is to try and structure conflicting biases into the decision-making process.
What does that mean in practice?
It means intentionally building mechanisms for dissent and alternative viewpoints into the system. Actively seeking out and empowering devil's advocates, individuals or teams, whose job it is to challenge the prevailing assumptions and interpretations. It means fostering constructive internal conflict among subordinates to ensure that diverse interpretations of ambiguous information actually get surfaced and debated rather than suppressed in favor of consensus.
So encourage disagreement, basically. Don't let everyone just nod along.
Essentially, yes. Make dissent respectable and expected. Roberta Wohlstetter, whose classic study of Pearl Harbor highlighted how signals were missed due to prevailing assumptions, argued for the importance of a willingness to play with material from different angles and in the context of unpopular as well as popular hypotheses. She said that's an essential ingredient of a good detective, and, by extension, a good intelligence analyst or decision maker. Explore all the possibilities, especially the uncomfortable ones.
These safeguards aren't free, of course. Setting up competing teams or encouraging dissent takes time, resources, and can increase internal friction.
Absolutely. Jervis notes these costs. They can divert resources, increase internal dissension, maybe slow down decision-making, but the potential benefit is huge. They increase the likelihood of making conscious choices about the way data were interpreted, rather than just unconsciously falling victim to unchallenged biases.
They force leaders to at least consider alternative images of the adversary, alternative explanations for events, rather than simply assuming their own initial interpretation is the only valid one.
Precisely. It's about institutionalizing skepticism and critical thinking.
Okay, so the key takeaway here for all of us, not just world leaders, is that we all have biases. The challenge is to recognize them, be humble about our own certainty, and actively seek out different perspectives. Maybe even create our own internal devil's advocates when making important decisions to ensure we're stress testing our assumptions and making the most informed choices possible. We've looked inside the government at organizational dynamics, Model 2, and inside the heads of individual leaders at their psychology. Now, let's pull back again, but in a different direction, to consider another crucial layer influencing international crises: the role of domestic forces, specifically public opinion and political accountability.
Right. James Fearon, in a really influential 1994 article called Domestic Political Audiences and the Escalation of International Disputes, offers a critical insight here. He argues that international crises are not just quiet interactions between diplomats or leaders behind closed doors. Often they're very public events carried out in front of domestic political audiences. And this public dimension fundamentally changes how leaders behave and how threats are perceived. #A. What makes a threat credible? Introducing audience costs.
So it's not just about what one leader says privately to another, but who's listening back home and what the political consequences might be.
Exactly. Fearon models international crises partly as a political war of attrition. At each moment in a developing crisis, a state can choose to attack, back down, or escalate further, maybe by making public threats, mobilizing troops, drawing lines in the sand.
Okay.
The critical factor he introduces are audience costs. What are these? Well, if state leader escalates a crisis, publicly makes a big speech, sends the fleet, talks tough, and then backs down without achieving their stated goals, they suffer audience costs.
Meaning their own people punish them.
Yes. These are penalties imposed by domestic audiences. Could be voters, political elites, rival factions, even just general public opinion for perceived weakness or foreign policy failure. The leader looks incompetent or irresolute or like they got bluffed. And crucially, Fearon argues, these potential costs increase as the public confrontation proceeds. The longer and louder the standoff, the higher the cost of backing down.
So the more a leader talks tough or takes visible actions, the more political skin they put in the game with their own people. They're raising the stakes for themselves.
Precisely. These audience costs, Fearon argues, are most important and characteristic of crisis bargaining because they make a leader's public actions informative about their state's actual willingness to fight. By taking public actions that generate audience costs, a leader can signal credible commitment. It provides a commitment or bridge burning effect. Once you've publicly committed, backing down becomes politically painful.
Okay, but what about other costs that might make a threat credible, like the actual financial cost of mobilizing troops or the sheer risk of an accidental war starting if things get tense? Don't those matter?
Fearon considers these alternative costs, but he argues they are generally less central to the specific dynamics of crisis bargaining than audience costs are. Physical costs, the money and organizational effort of mobilization, like Israel calling up reserves or the U.S. deploying for Desert Shield, while real, are rarely the principal concern driving decisions in the heat of a crisis compared to the perceptions of domestic and foreign audiences. Similarly, the risks of accidental war, what Thomas Schelling famously called the threat that leaves something to chance, like a mechanical mishap or an unauthorized launch. Fearon argues that while this is a factor, and leaders certainly worried about it during Cuba, leaders are often much more concerned about risks of war connected to what the other side would choose to do in response to escalation rather than purely accidental triggers. Audience costs directly tie into that signaling and credibility gained between leaders.
So The fear of looking weak or foolish to your own people is often a stronger motivator in a crisis standoff than the direct cost of mobilizing troops or the abstract risk of a random accident. That's a surprising claim.
It's a key part of his argument about what makes threats credible in a public showdown. He points to historical examples. During the Nootka crisis in the 1780s, Britain and Spain nearly went to war over Vancouver Island. The British Prime Minister, William Pitt, mobilized the Navy and made forceful public threats against Spain. Critically, an election was looming in Britain, and as one observer noted, the opposition was ready to make the most of any of the government's mistakes. Pitt faced potentially serious domestic political costs for backing down. His public stance generated audience costs, making his threats much more credible. When Spain eventually conceded, Pitt was praised at home for his diplomatic triumph, reinforcing the idea that leaders are judged domestically on these outcomes.
Right. This really drives home why public rhetoric and visible actions in a crisis aren't just posturing for the international audience. They can literally paint a leader into a corner domestically, forcing them to follow through or pay a steep political price at home. It fundamentally changes the dynamics of the game.
Okay, here's where Fearon's work gets really interesting and maybe counterintuitive. You'd normally think that in a crisis, the side with the bigger military or the side with more at stake intrinsically would be more likely to win, to make the other side back down. But Fearon suggests something different, right?
He does. It's one of the most striking findings from his formal model. Once a crisis escalates into a public contest of wills, Fearon finds that neither the observable balance of military forces nor the balance of intrinsic interests, meaning how much each side objectively values the prize they're fighting over, has a direct effect on which side is ultimately more likely to back down.
Wait, really? So military might, or how much you care about the issue, isn't the final decider once you're in a public standoff? That seems hard to believe. It seems counterintuitive, but here's the nuance. Fearon argues that rational leaders do consider these observable factors, like military strength and the value of the stakes, before deciding whether to initiate or escalate a crisis in the first place.
Okay.
For example, a militarily weak state is unlikely to even start resisting a much stronger state unless it is exceptionally resolved, unless it cares immensely more about the issue than the stronger state does. So the very fact that a crisis has erupted and both sides have chosen to escalate suggests that these easily observable factors aren't telling the whole story. If it was just about who was stronger, the weaker side probably wouldn't have resisted in the first place.
So those factors matter in determining whether a crisis even begins or whether a state challenges the status quo. But they don't necessarily predict the outcome once both sides are locked in a public test of nerve.
Precisely. According to Fearon's model, what does matter more in that escalated moment, in determining who blinks first, is the combination of relative audience costs, which side stands to lose more domestically by backing down, and the privately known elements of each state's resolve, their true willingness to fight, which isn't perfectly observable to the other side.
Okay, so it comes back to those audience costs. How do they influence who backs down?
Greater potential audience costs improve a state's ability to credibly commit and signal its resolve. If a state whose leader faces high potential audience cost for backing down still chooses to escalate publicly, that action serves as a relatively informative and credible signal of their willingness to fight.
Why? Because that leader is demonstrably putting so much more on the line domestically. They wouldn't do that unless they were serious.
Exactly. They are showing a strong commitment to seeing the conflict through, because the alternative, backing down after making a public stand, would be so politically damaging for them at home. It reverses the common intuition. You might think a leader who doesn't care about domestic opinion could escalate more freely, but Fearon argues the opposite. The greater the potential costs generated by escalating the audience costs, the more credible the signal of resolve is when a leader is willing to incur those potential costs by escalating.
So it's about how much political skin a leader demonstrably puts in the game. That completely changes the playbook. It's not just about military muscle, but about political vulnerability and the willingness to risk domestic punishment.
That's the core idea. The side that can generate higher audience costs for itself might be able to signal its resolve more effectively. And in the war of attrition, the side with a higher overall value for fighting, which includes both the intrinsic stakes and avoiding the audience costs of backing down, may be able to hold out longer, reaching the point faster where it prefers actual conflict to paying the escalating political price of conceding. Okay, this theory about audience costs leads us directly to a crucial distinction Fearon makes between different types of political systems, specifically democracies versus authoritarian states.
How do they differ in terms of audience costs?
Fearon argues that audience costs are likely to be most significant in states where foreign policy is conducted by an agent on behalf of a principal, as in democracies.
Okay, break that down. Agent and principal.
Think of it like this. In democracies, the leaders, the president, the prime minister of the government, are the agents carrying out foreign policies. But they are ultimately accountable to the principals, the voters, the public, maybe the legislature, who put them in power and can remove them.
Right. Elections, public opinion polls, media scrutiny.
Exactly. In democracies, leaders are accountable to voters and other domestic groups who can sanction them, electorally or otherwise, for perceived foreign policy failures. This accountability structure creates a credible mechanism for generating audience costs. If a democratic leader makes a big public threat and then backs down humiliatingly, they risk losing public support, losing allies in parliament, maybe even losing the next election. Those are real, tangible costs.
And authoritarian states, they don't have that same kind of accountability, or at least not in the same way.
That's the argument. In many authoritarian states, the leader is the principal, or the mechanisms of accountability are far weaker, less transparent, and less regularized. An authoritarian leader might claim they'll suffer costs for backing down. They might try to bluff by saying their prestige is on the line, but they also cannot credibly commit to suffering significant, unavoidable domestic punishment, like actually losing power in the same way a democratic leader facing an election might. It's harder for them to tie their own hands convincingly.
So this leads to a key prediction.
Yes. A key comparative statics result from Fearon's model is that, all else being equal, the side with greater potential audience costs is always more likely to back down in disputes that become public contests. Since democracies are argued to have higher potential audience costs due to their accountability structures, this implies that democracies should, on average, back down less often in public crises, especially when facing authoritarian states which have lower audience costs.
So a democracy's public commitment, because it carries real potential domestic consequences for the leader, is inherently more believable, more credible than an authoritarian leader's bluster.
That's the core argument. Think of some historical examples that seem to fit this pattern. Public declarations by Democratic leaders like Lord Salisbury during the Fashoda crisis with France, or Lloyd George's Mansion House speech during the Agadir crisis with Germany, or JFK's televised address announcing the Soviet missiles in Cuba, or George H.W. Bush's "This aggression against Kuwait will not stand." Remark: these public commitments by leaders accountable to domestic audiences carried significant weight precisely because backing down would have been so costly for them politically.
Right.
Compare that, Fearon suggests, to the often more forceful public bluster by authoritarian leaders. Think of Hitler, Khrushchev banging his shoe, Mao, Saddam Hussein. While certainly intimidating, it often appears to create fewer credible audience costs. It was notoriously difficult for observers to gauge Saddam Hussein's true willingness to fight over Kuwait in 1990-91, partly because it was unclear what specific domestic political costs, if any, he would actually suffer if he made concessions. His grip on power wasn't really contingent on Iraqi public opinion in the same way a democratic leader's is.
This offers a really powerful and maybe surprising insight into why democracies might be perceived as more resolved, or at least why their signals might be clearer, in a public crisis. Their leaders literally have more to lose back home if they bluff and get called.
Exactly. It suggests that democracies may, under certain conditions, be able to signal their intentions more credibly and clearly than authoritarian states. Fearon even speculates this might help ameliorate the security dilemma between democratic states, contributing to the democratic peace phenomenon. If democracies can trust each other's signals more, maybe conflict is less likely. That's a huge potential takeaway. #, misperception, and the grim reality of war.
We've explored the structures, the politics, the psychology, the domestic pressures, all the complex layers influencing decisions. Now we have to confront the grim bottom line. How these various factors, especially the errors in perception and judgment we've discussed, can lead to the ultimate failure of international relations, the outbreak of war.
Yes. Jack S. Levy's work, particularly his article Misperception and the Causes of War, directly connects these psychological biases and flawed decision processes to the actual initiation of conflict. He strongly critiques traditional rational models of war that assume accurate perceptions and optimal cost-benefit calculations by leaders.
He finds those models unrealistic.
Deeply unrealistic. Levy argues they are inconsistent with a growing body of theory, systematic empirical research, and historical case studies on decision-making and crisis behavior. The evidence just doesn't support the idea that most wars start from perfectly rational calculations based on accurate information. Misperception is often central.
So war isn't always a rational choice based on facts. It can be born from profound misunderstanding, from leaders acting on flawed beliefs.
Very often, yes. Livy defines misperception simply as a discrepancy between the psychological environment of the decision-makers and the operational environment of the real world. Leaders make their decisions based on their perception of reality, their psychological environment. But the consequences of those decisions unfold in the actual reality, the operational environment. When those two diverge significantly, disaster can follow.
He's careful about defining misperception, though, right? He excludes some things.
Yes. For the purpose of empirical analysis, Levy focuses on misperceptions that are, in principle, measurable or falsifiable. He wants to look at discrepancies between beliefs and reality concerning things like an adversary's intentions or capabilities. He generally excludes broader, more normative judgments like the diabolical enemy image, believing the enemy is inherently evil, or a moral self-image, believing your own side is inherently righteous. While these images are undoubtedly important psychologically, they're harder to empirically verify or falsify as simple misperceptions of reality.
So what are the key forms of misperception that do directly contribute to war, according to Levy?
He highlights several critical forms. Misperceiving the adversary's intentions, thinking they are more hostile or less hostile than they actually are. Misperceiving the adversary's perceptions, essentially a lack of empathy, failing to understand how they see the situation and your actions, and misunderstanding the adversary's decision-making process, for example, falling prey to that centralization bias we discussed, assuming they are more unified or rational than they really are.
And the timing matters.
Yes. Levy emphasizes that the misperceptions that most directly influence the crucial decisions made immediately prior to the outbreak of war are particularly critical. These are the final cognitive errors, the last misjudgments that push leaders over the brink from crisis to conflict.
This really highlights how easy it might be to think of war as some kind of rational, calculated policy choice. But often, it seems, it's born from a profound misunderstanding of the actual situation, like two people arguing past each other, based on completely different assumptions about reality, but with vastly, tragically higher stakes. One of the most common and perhaps tragic forms of misperception leading to war, I imagine, is leaders simply believing they can win easily. Overconfidence.
Absolutely. Levy identifies military overconfidence as a primary pathway to war. It often stems directly from an underestimation of the adversary's capabilities or overestimation of one's own capabilities, or often a combination of both.
And this leads to the idea of a quick, cheap war.
Exactly. Leaders frequently fall prey to what Levy and others call the short war illusion. They often expect not just victory, but a relatively short war involving minimum costs. They convince themselves it will be over quickly, before the real pain sets in.
And history is just littered with examples of this disastrous optimism, isn't it?
Shockingly, depressingly so. Levy rattles off some chilling quotes. A Russian general before the Russo-Turkish War in 1877, predicting the war, will resolve itself into a mere military promenade. Hitler, after conquering Poland, boasting that a campaign against Russia would be like a child's game in a sandbox.
Unbelievable.
Kaiser Wilhelm before World War I, assuring his departing troops they'd be home before the leaves had fallen from the trees. Even Secretary McNamara, a supposed rationalist, expressing confidence early in the Vietnam War that the boys would be home before Christmas. It's a recurring pattern across time and cultures.
And often both sides are optimistic.
That's particularly dangerous. Levy notes that in 1914, leaders in virtually all the major European capitals expected a short, victorious war. They were all wrong. Think of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Athens expected a relatively quick victory based on its naval power and strategy. The war dragged on for over a quarter century and devastated Athens.
So overestimating your own strength or underestimating the enemy's is a major driver. What about misperceiving support from other countries, allies or potential allies?
That's another critical factor Levy points out. Exaggerating the likelihood or the military impact of support from potential friends can also fuel overconfidence and make war seem like a better gamble.
Any examples?
Well, think about the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain likely misperceived the military balance, perhaps underestimating English naval capabilities and resilience. Or William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066. His success was significantly aided by an entirely unpredictable Norwegian invasion occurring simultaneously, which drew English forces away. That wasn't something William could have rationally counted on. More recently, the Suez Crisis in 1956 saw Israel, Britain, and France badly miscalculate the likely U.S. response. They clearly underestimated the diplomatic and economic opposition they would face from Washington, which ultimately forced their withdrawal. Misjudging third-party intervention can dramatically alter the expected outcome of a conflict.
Levy makes an important distinction here, though, doesn't he? Between genuine misperception and just bad luck. War is inherently uncertain.
Yes, that's a crucial methodological point. War is, as Clausewitz famously said, the province of uncertainty, friction, and chance. So when a state starts a war and loses, when can we attribute that loss to misperception versus just the unpredictable fortunes of war?
How do we tell the difference?
Levy suggests some criteria. We might infer misperception if the pre-war estimates of the balance of capabilities were unreasonable given the information available at the time, or if decision-makers seemed insensitive to the uncertainties involved, displaying excessive confidence, or if we have evidence that non-rational factors like wishful thinking, biases, domestic political needs clearly distorted their capability estimates, or simply if the estimates turned out to be grossly inaccurate and subsequent events show that pure chance played no significant part in the outcome. It's not always easy to disentangle, but the attempt is crucial.
This really highlights a tragic, recurrent human tendency, a dangerous optimism about our own strength and our prospects for easy victory, an illusion that has often led nations into prolonged, devastating conflicts that nobody truly anticipated at the outset. Okay, so misjudging capabilities is one major path to war. But beyond just tanks and troop numbers, judging an adversary's intentions, what they plan to do must be even harder, right? And potentially just as dangerous if you get it wrong.
Absolutely. Statesmen themselves have often acknowledged that intentions are far more opaque and difficult to assess reliably than capabilities. Capabilities you can sometimes count or estimate. Intentions reside inside someone else's head. And misperceiving those intentions, Levy argues, is another major cause of war.
So one way this works is seeing the enemy as more hostile than they actually are.
Yes, the overestimation of hostility or aggressiveness is a key misperception Levy identifies. Believing the other side is inherently expansionist, implacably hostile, and poised to attack when maybe they aren't or aren't yet.
And what does that lead to?
It often fuels worst-case analysis, assuming the worst possible interpretation of any ambiguous action the adversary takes. This, in turn, can lead to unnecessary military buildups, arms races, and deepening spirals of mistrust and tension, the classic security dilemma. These conflict spirals, Levy notes, can then escalate all the way to war, often through further miscalculations, perceptions of hostility, and the inevitability of war. Each side's defensive measures are seen by the other as proof of aggressive intent.
He gives the example of WWI again.
Yes, he cites historical analyses suggesting that some key British Foreign Office officials before World War I tended to overestimate German aggressiveness, interpreting German naval buildup, for instance, in the most threatening possible light, which contributed to the pre-war tension and arms race. This fear of the other's intent can lead to actions that tragically become self-fulfilling prophecies.
But the opposite mistake can be just as bad, or maybe even worse, underestimating the enemy's hostility, failing to see a real threat when it's there.
Absolutely. Levy argues that the underestimation of hostility or aggressiveness is a frequent cause of deterrence failure, which can also lead directly to war. This happens when leaders fail to recognize genuine threats, dismiss clear warning signs, or appease an aggressor in the mistaken belief that their ambitions are limited or reasonable.
And we've seen some stark examples of this already.
Yes, several of the cases we discussed under psychological biases fit here perfectly. Hitler's miscalculation that Britain and France wouldn't actually fight over Poland in 1939, he underestimated their resolve and intent. Stalin's catastrophic refusal to believe Hitler would invade in 1941, underestimating Hitler's hostile intent despite overwhelming evidence. MacArthur and Truman underestimating China's intent to intervene in Korea in 1950, and the U.S. and Israel underestimating Egypt and Syria's intent to attack in 1973. In all these cases, leaders simply didn't believe the adversary would act aggressively or had hostile intentions, despite mounting signals. Their underestimation proved disastrous.
There's also the risk of misperceiving how effective your own coercive actions will be, right? Thinking a threat or a limited strike will work when it won't.
Yes, that's another facet.
Yeah.
Leaders might misperceive that their coercive moves, making threats, mobilizing forces, launching limited military actions, will be effective in achieving their goals without triggering a wider war. They might overestimate the adversary's willingness to back down or underestimate their resolve to fight back. This can lead to war either through miscalculation, oops, they didn't fold like I expected, or through unintended escalation and loss of control once the shooting starts.
So it's a dangerous tightrope. Believing the worst about an adversary can provoke them and lead to unnecessary conflict spirals. But believing the best, or underestimating their hostility, can leave you fatally vulnerable when a real threat emerges. Getting the assessment of intentions right is incredibly difficult, yet absolutely critical. #outro.
Well, deep divers, what an incredible and, frankly, somewhat sobering journey we've had today. We've taken a truly deep dive into the complex world of international relations decision-making. We've shown, I hope, how our understanding of massive events like the Cuban Missile Crisis is shaped by far more than just the surface-level facts you might read in a headline.
Absolutely. We've seen how governments can operate simultaneously through different logics, sometimes like rational actors making calculated choices, Model 1, sometimes like collections of large organizations grinding out routine outputs, Model 2, and often like political battlegrounds where individuals pull and haul for influence and outcomes, Model 3. Unpacking Graham Allison's 3 conceptual models gives us really powerful new lenses. And then we plunged into the fascinating, sometimes frustrating, realm of human psychology. We explored those deep currents, the cognitive biases like confirmation bias, the powerful influence of prior expectations and historical analogies, the fundamental attribution error that makes us judge others harshly while excusing ourselves. It's a potent reminder that even the most powerful leaders are, at the end of the day, fundamentally human, with all the cognitive limitations that entails.
Right. And we also learned about that hidden power of audience costs from James Fearon's work, how the domestic political context, the need for leaders to maintain credibility with their own people, can make threats credible or incredible. It's a really surprising insight into why public rhetoric matters so much in a crisis and why democracies might actually have a unique, if sometimes burdensome, advantage in signaling their resolve compared to authoritarian states.
And finally, we confronted the grim reality, drawing on Jack Levy's crucial work of how all these factors, flawed conceptual models, cognitive biases, political pressures, can tragically pave the way for miscalculations that trigger war. Especially those misperceptions of capabilities, leading to the dangerous short war illusion, and misperceptions of intentions, either seeing threats that aren't there or, perhaps more catastrophically, failing to see threats that are.
So what does all this complexity mean for you listening right now? Well, this isn't just abstract academic theory. We believe it's a genuinely useful toolkit for understanding the world around you, for interpreting the news, making sense of global events, and maybe even reflecting on your own decision-making processes in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. The next time you see a nation take a surprising action or a leader make a bold, maybe perplexing statement, try running it through these layers of analysis we've discussed. Ask yourself, does this look primarily like a rational choice based on national interest, Model 1? Or does it feel more like an organizational output, maybe something constrained by standard procedures, Model 2? Or could this be the messy result of internal political bargaining, Model 3?
And then add the psychological layer. What cognitive biases might be at play here for them or even for us interpreting them? Are historical analogies being used, perhaps inappropriately? Are they likely falling prey to the attribution error? And don't forget the domestic angle. What domestic audience is this leader speaking to? What are the potential audience costs involved in this stance?
By asking these kinds of questions, you move beyond simplistic narratives and start to gain a much richer, more nuanced understanding of why things happen on the world stage. You can appreciate the multiple forces at work. And that leads us, as always, to a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Given everything we've discussed today, the inherent complexities and distortions of human perception, the inertia of large organizations, the messy reality of political bargaining, the power of domestic audiences, is true objective rationality in foreign policy ever fully achievable? Or is it always going to be shaped, perhaps inevitably, by these non-rational factors? Are we, as a species, simply condemned to sort of muddle through, always operating with imperfect information and biased lenses, just hoping our inevitable misperceptions don't lead to catastrophe?
That's a heavy question to end on.
It is, but it's one worth pondering long after this deep dive ends. Thanks for joining us.